Yes. Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction, Brad. I'm really excited to be here. As Brad mentioned, I was a student of Craig Anderson's at Iowa State University. So I am an aggression researcher, former aggression researcher. And it feels like I'm coming to a full circle now by presenting this work to this audience. Now, this work is actually coming from, believe it or not, an existential moment I recently had as I was preparing my promotion materials and trying to make sense of what I've been doing for the last 10 so many years, what's the purpose and point of all of my research. And thankfully, from that exercise, I was able to understand a framework of how media depictions at a macro level are affecting intergroup relations between majority and minority groups. So that's what I'd like to talk about in this talk. So the central idea guiding this work is that media depictions of racial and ethnic groups are not just isolated messages, they're forming reoccurring patterns that together create a shared symbolic environment. And this symbolic environment communicates how groups are evaluated, their relative status in that society, and then also who is seen as threatening, but who is also seen as belonging to that mainstream culture. Of course, we know that exposure to these representations produces different psychological responses among majority members of that society and then also minority members within that society. And these parallel responses are shaping intergroup relations in a systematic way. The specific nature of these effects will depend on how minority groups are depicted within mainstream media of any given society. Today, I'm going to focus a lot on American media, but there are similar patterns found in other countries as well, where there's a lot of research on the content analyses documenting the way that different groups are depicted in different types of countries. But for the purpose of this talk, I'm focusing on American media, and I'm focusing more on what I'm calling mainstream media. So media that's for the masses. So news that's for mass audiences, TV shows, movies, not so much alternative types of media or niche media or media, social media even. Although there's reason to believe that systematic patterns that are within mass media are also kind of having downstream consequences to these other types of media as well. But for this talk, we're going to focus on mainstream media. And we know from content analyses of American media that many racial ethnic minorities tend to be depicted in a more negative light within threat kinds of frames, such as having them be exposed as criminals, as terrorists, or as groups that are just threatening dominant cultural values and ways of life. Of course, over time, there's been changes with respect to how groups are being depicted, and some have enjoyed more favorable and nuanced representations. But overall, when we compare minority groups to those of the majority depictions, there is still more of that negative kind of framing. And what I'm going to show in this talk is that exposure to these types of depictions over time are shaping majority members' hostility towards these groups, specifically by increasing threat appraisals as well as negative emotions towards them, such as anger, disgust, and fear. And of course, these mechanisms have downstream consequences for behaviors such as avoidance, aggression towards these groups, and even support for policies that are harming members of these groups. For minority group members, the same types of negative depictions of their group are communicating something different. They're signaling that one's in-group is not respected or valued within the broader society, and they're actually influencing perceptions of group worth as well as a sense of belonging within that broader society. And repeated exposure to these types of images, similar to experiences of discrimination, are threatening the social identities of minorities, and they're creating conflict between their identification and their sense of integration within that society. And they're going to have downstream consequences for the overall societal and political disengagement that these groups feel with that majority culture and with its people and its institutions. So these parallel effects on majority and minority groups are unfolding simultaneously, and they're affecting each other reciprocally, creating ultimately strained and adverse intergroup relations at a societal level. What I'm going to do is I'm going to present empirical evidence from several studies that are testing these different types of processes in this model. And much of the work is going to focus on Muslim and non-Muslim relations in the US, although similar patterns, as I said, have been documented for other minority groups. But I think there is a specific reason for why we want to look at Muslims, and that's because despite that being a relatively small and very highly ethnically diverse population, in the US, public perceptions of this group are both homogenous but also very negative and intense, suggesting that there are factors outside of maybe direct experiences, likely media representations that I'm going to argue, that are shaping these types of perceptions. So before discussing the empirical research, I want to quickly highlight some demographic realities of this population, which are important to consider as we talk about these effects. First, Muslims are approximately 1% of the US population, yet as I'm going to show, public perceptions of this group often differ substantially from this demographic reality. Second, Muslims are one of the most ethnically diverse faith communities in the US, with the majority identifying as people of color. And third, Muslims in the US are significantly more likely than the general population to be recent immigrants. And these points are really important to keep in mind as we're talking about issues of integration and belonging and feeling as if you're part of the mainstream culture. So these demographic realities are interesting also because they're challenging a lot of widespread public misperceptions of this group, as well as media portrayals that frequently depict Muslims as a monolith, or depictions of all Muslims as Arabs or all Arabs as Muslims, or as suggesting that they're actually a much larger share of the population than they really are. And this is a very common perception. So various kinds of survey evidence show that people in many Western countries substantially overestimate the size of their Muslim population. And I think one reason for this, because the population size, as you can see, is actually quite minimal, one reason for this overperception of the population is because of the amount of coverage that this group gets within the mainstream media of those countries. So, for instance, content analyses of American news show that Muslims receive a disproportional coverage relative to their population size, increasing the salience of this group in the public's mind. So, if you take a look at the amount of news depictions of this group relative to other groups over time, you can see that Muslims have experienced the greatest increase in coverage relative to other racial ethnic minority groups. And when you compare them from where it used to be, let's say like around 2000s or so, which was right before 9/11, a really important moment in shaping perceptions towards this group. And you kind of see how that's progressed over time. You notice that this is the group that's received a kind of overrepresentation in news coverage as opposed to other minority groups. Now, beyond the quantity of coverage, the quality of coverage also shows a very negative pattern. So, sentiment analyses of broadcast news reveal that Muslims are represented significantly more unfavorably than other racial ethnic groups. And although the intensity of negativity varies somewhat across outlets, the relative pattern is really consistent, where Muslims are depicted more negatively than comparable groups across different news environments. When comparing across other religious groups, content analyses reveal a particular bias towards Muslims, where 80% of the news articles representing Muslims are negative, but for other groups, it might be closer to about 50-50. And this bias is not just specific to the US, but rather is reflected in news content of other Western countries as well. So these findings of content analyses are really showing that Muslims are not only overly represented within mainstream media, but they're also consistently and negatively represented, mostly in threatening kinds of ways. So we're going to see now how exposure to these media depictions of Muslims is influencing the way that majority members are thinking and feeling about them. First, I'm going to present an experimental study that's going to test how exposure to news depictions of Muslims influences reactions towards them. So in this study, we randomly assigned 300 non-Muslim American participants to watch one of three types of news clips, and then we assessed their perceptions of Muslims as threats and their support for public policies that are harming Muslims domestically as well as internationally. So here, we randomly assigned them to three different types of conditions. In the negative condition, they watched a negative news clip, which was discussing the Fort Dix, New Jersey attempted attack by radicalized Muslim men. This was around 2007, 2008. In the neutral news clip, they were discussing a high school changing their football practice time to accommodate Muslim players who are fasting during Ramadan. So not something that's overly positive or overly negative. And in the positive news condition, they were showing a Muslim organization that was volunteering at a food shelter during the holiday season. So a very positive kind of a behavior. Of course, we made sure that all the videos were approximately the same length and they were pre-tested to make sure that they were equivalent on important dimensions, such as how interesting or accurate or trustworthy these videos might be. Now, the main outcomes that we were interested in were assessing perceptions of Muslims as threats. So agreement with statements like Muslims are aggressive, they're violent, they're threatening, but also support for harmful policies. So domestic policies, which would be for Muslims living in America, that they should be monitored without their consent, that they should have separate and more thorough airport security lines, but also international policies, which was using military action in predominantly Muslim countries. So drone attacks in Pakistan or reducing the influence of Islam in different Middle Eastern countries, things of that sort. And what we found was a pattern that we expected, such that participants who watched the negative news clips were significantly more likely to perceive Muslims as threatening compared to participants in the neutral and positive conditions. And the same pattern was found for support for civil restrictions for Muslim Americans, as well as support for military action in Muslim countries. So here we have significant differences emerging between the negative condition and the other two conditions. And the neutral and the positive conditions were significantly different from each other for threat appraisals and for support for military action, but not for civil restrictions. Now, of course, these kind of effects that we observed from an experimental studies, they're going to have long-term kinds of consequences when these types of media portrayals are repeated. And as we saw in content analyses, they in fact are repeated across different news sources and also over time. And so in another longitudinal study, we were interested in understanding if people who rely on media for source of information about this group relative to other sources over time are thinking about this group in a more threatening way and are feeling anger towards them, subsequently increasing the likelihood of them supporting the kinds of policies that I just talked about. So this study was done using non-Muslim American college students, and it was done across 3 waves where we collected measures for all time points so that we could look at residual changes in our outcomes over time. And here we were interested in the extent to which people rely on media as a source of information for Muslims. So again, mainstream media from news, from TV shows, from movies, but also we wanted to contrast that with sources of direct contact, because from contact theory, we would imagine that those who rely more on direct contact for a source of information about this group should be less susceptible to the media influence. It should have other alternative sources that are counteracting what they're seeing in media about this group. And we controlled for age, sex, and political orientation. The main mechanisms that we were interested in are similar to the previous study. So perceptions of Muslims as threatening, but also the anger that you would feel at Muslims. So how angry do you feel? How much hostility do you feel towards this group? Things of that sort. And we also assessed their support for public policies that are harming Muslims, both domestically and internationally, similar to the previous study. So using a SEM model, we tested the hypothesized relations. We, of course, had autoregressive paths that were looking at residual changes, so controlling for the baseline assessments of our outcomes and looking at how changes over time are being predicted by our hypothesized predictors. And what we found is that reliance on media as a source of information about Muslims at time 1 increased anger at Muslims at time 2, but also perceptions of Muslims as threatening. And these psychological mechanisms of hostility increase support for public policies that were harming Muslims, both domestically and internationally. Reliance on direct contact produced the opposite effect for anger towards Muslims, but was non-significant in this analysis with respect to threatening perceptions of Muslims. So what we can see from these two studies is that reliance on media for information about Muslims and also exposure to media, which is negatively representing Muslims, can increase perceptions of Muslims as aggressive, as threatening. It can also increase anger towards them and subsequently support for policies that are harming Muslims. But as we found in the last study, contact with Muslims actually has the opposite effect. In an experimental study, we could see that exposure to positive media actually reduces a lot of this hostility. And that goes back to the very first point I made, how a lot of these processes ultimately depend on the way that these groups are being depicted within those mainstream societies, in their mainstream media. So far, I've shown what media depictions are doing to the majority group. Now I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about how the same kinds of depictions are influencing the minority members and the way that they're thinking about their groups and the way that they're being depicted and what kinds of downstream consequences that has on them. So a lot of these ideas are based on social identity theory, which highlights the importance of group identity for individual sense of self and also the motivation to see your group in a positive manner. But of course, we know that a lot of individuals, minorities, will have threats to that social identity in the form of interpersonal experiences of discrimination. But I'm arguing also through how they're seeing their groups being depicted within that mainstream media. So when they see their group being depicted in a negative light, that threatens that sense of positive distinctiveness, and that motivates them to seek coping strategies where they are now going to either avoid those situations or distance themselves from those situations, which are the source of that identity threat. So in the remaining talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about studies that are now examining how media exposure is influencing Muslims themselves and the way that they're thinking about their group identity, as well as their integration within mainstream society. So first, let's talk about the possible effects on group esteem. So in this first study that I'm going to present, we're looking at how different types of entertainment media is influencing Muslim American high school students' group esteem, or the way that they feel about their Muslim identity. And we examine this longitudinally in adolescents because adolescents are actually in the midst of meaning making and negotiating their identities, and they're actually quite vulnerable to external sources of socialization, such as the media that they're consuming. So here we recruited a diverse sample of Muslim American high school students of different ethnicities over 3 years. And the goal was to compare how the different types of media they're consuming is influencing their group esteem. So we first described this idea of ethnic media, which is created by and created for people of particular ethnic groups. And the idea was to see if that media is having a different type of effect than the mainstream American media, in which their groups tend to be depicted more negatively. Now, earlier, this ethnic media used to be consumed through like satellite channels, but now with digital streaming platforms, this is actually more readily available so that populations have access to watching media from their cultures, which obviously represents their groups in a more positive and nuanced way. So we assessed how often they watch ethnic media as well as mainstream American media, things like TV shows and movies. And we were interested in this outcome of group esteem, which is how good do they feel about their Muslim identity? Do they feel proud of it? Things of that sort. So, using latent growth modeling, we first discovered that Muslim American high school students' group esteem declines over the 3 years that we sampled, or we actually ran the study. And the older they got, the worse they felt about their Muslim identity. And that's consistent with a lot of other recent immigrant populations where their identities are stigmatized in the mainstream culture. Interestingly, ethnic media was positively associated with group esteem at the beginning of the study, but no significant findings emerged for the slope. But mainstream media was positively associated with group esteem at the beginning of the study, but over time, it was inversely associated with the slope. In other words, individuals who are more exposed to mainstream entertainment media experienced a steeper decline in group esteem over time. So although they will start with a higher group esteem, their esteem declines more rapidly across the 3 years relative to those that have lower exposure to mainstream media. So this is showing how watching your group in threatening ways can ultimately have an adverse effect on your group esteem. And next, we're going to try to see how that could influence your sense of belonging and identification with that mainstream culture. So here we looked at two different types of identity threats. First, interpersonal experiences of discrimination, which are very common. So to what extent you've been personally discriminated because of your identity, but also how threats from the media are influencing those kinds of perceptions of belonging and integration as well. So this was a study where we had 4 waves, and we assessed experiences of discrimination as well as exposure to negative depictions of Muslims. So these were self-reported. How often do you see Muslims being depicted in the media in a negative way, in a threatening way, in an aggressive way? And the outcome that we were interested in was this idea of identity permeability. And perceptions of identity permeability, according to social identity theory, indicate the extent to which minority populations feel they can be included and accepted within the majority identity culture. So these could be assessed from items like, I could be regarded as a member of the society if I wanted to be, or no matter what effort I make, I'll never be considered an American. So using latent growth modeling again, we discovered that Muslim Americans' perceptions of identity impermeability is increasing over time. So the older they get, the more likely they are to think that they cannot be regarded as Americans. Interpersonal experiences of discrimination were positively associated with impermeability perceptions at the intercept level, but not significantly associated with the slope. But exposure to negative media was not significantly associated with impermeability perceptions at the intercept, but it was positively associated with the slope, suggesting that exposure to media representing Muslims in a negative light is increasing perceptions that Muslims cannot be considered as. And if identity threats are reducing these kinds of perceptions of identity impermeability, then we would imagine they're also going to influence how strongly individuals can identify with the national identity and their subsequent social engagement and political engagement behaviors. So in the next study that I'm going to show, we experimentally tested if exposure to identity-threatening media can influence this kind of a distancing from mainstream identity as well as the people of that culture. So here what we did was an experiment with a community sample of 182 Muslim American adults, of course, with various different ethnicities. And we randomly assigned them to watch either a negative news clip of their group, so a clip in where Muslims were being represented in a negative way, similar to the experimental study I talked about in the beginning of the talk with the majority group, or a neutral way, so that clip about the high school changing their football practice time to accommodate players during Ramadan. The outcomes that we were interested in was disidentification as an American. So the idea that I don't have any desire to be accepted by other Americans, or I don't identify as an American. And these are really important concepts to understand from the context of immigration, because when immigrants do not strongly identify with a national identity, it has really important consequences for their overall integration and their ability to think that they can get involved in the social and political institutions of that society. We were also interested in assessing their intentions to avoid non-Muslims, so the majority group of that culture. So we assessed that by asking to what extent they would want to avoid non-Muslim Americans, have nothing to do with them, be friends with them. That would be reverse coded to kind of assess these behavioral intentions. And what we found is that participants in the negative video condition were more likely to disidentify as an American and more likely to avoid non-Muslim Americans compared to participants who watched that control neutral news video condition. And these findings are actually very similar to research that looks at discrimination-based effects. So here we're seeing that threats that are coming from media are very similar to the kinds of threats that people might experience interpersonally when they're discriminated because of their stigmatized identities. And these identity dynamics, so not identifying with that national identity, wanting to distance themselves from that majority culture, have other kinds of social and political implications as well. And that's what we're going to look at in this longitudinal study that was done, where we wanted to compare threats that they might experience interpersonally, as well as threats that they're experiencing through the media environment, and how that's influencing their national identification. So their identification as an American, but also their political trust in the US government. So to what extent they believe that the US government cares about people like them. We also looked at whether or not these identity threats, whether interpersonally experienced or experienced through the media, are influencing the extent to which they identify as a Muslim. There are ideas from rejection identification models which suggest that when minorities are threatened, they sometimes might get closer to their stigmatized identity as a way to cope with that threat and as a way to find a sense of support. However, a lot of these findings actually haven't been found in immigrant populations. They've mostly been found in populations that have been in the US for generations and thus consider themselves to be just as American as everybody else. So that's why we looked at this as a research question. So again, this is from a diverse sample of Muslim American students, and we measured this across 3 waves happening during the 2016 US presidential election. And all measures were assessed at all time points so that we could look at those residual changes in our outcomes over time. So some of the predictors that we were interested in were how often they're exposed to negative news coverage of Muslims. So how often they see news stories where Muslims are perpetrating violence, where they're seen as criminals or as terrorists. We also asked about interpersonal experiences of discrimination, how often they've personally been discriminated because of their religion. We assessed their identification with both identities as an American, but then also as a Muslim separately, so that we could look at their unique effects. And then the outcome that we were interested in was their political trust. So to what extent they trust the government, to what extent they think that the government is representing the interests of people like them, things of that sort. So again, we used a SEM model and we tested the hypothesized relations by looking first by controlling those autoregressive paths to look at residual changes. And so here we first see, surprisingly, that discrimination did not significantly influence that strength of Muslim identification over time. Neither did the negative media coverage. And to our surprise, interpersonal experience of discrimination also did not significantly influence the strength of their identification as an American. However, exposure to negative media coverage of their group was inversely associated with how strongly they identified as an American at time 2. And that had downstream consequences for their political trust. So the stronger you identify as an American, the more political trust you have in the US government. But if you do not identify strongly, then you obviously don't have as much political trust in the US government. This was also interesting because it countered a lot of the other speculations that exist in debates about immigration with respect to this community, that perhaps it's their Muslim identity that is somehow an obstacle or a barrier that's preventing them from successfully integrating into mainstream societies or trusting its political institutions. The Muslim identity actually did not significantly relate to political trust. It was the American identity that was related to the political trust. Of course, we found an indirect effect such that exposure to negative media coverage reduced political trust due to that reduced strength of identification as. So across these different studies that I just presented today, the evidence is suggesting that media representation, media environments are functioning as this powerful socializing system that's shaping intergroup relations in 2 parallel ways. First, these repeated threats, these 3 repeated depictions of these groups as threatening is increasing majority group hostility towards them, and also support for exclusionary attitudes, as well as support for public policies that are harming members of this group. At the same time, the same representations are signaling to minority groups that their groups are devalued and they do not fully belong within the society. And that's producing identity threats. It's creating conflicts between the way that they see themselves being part of that national identity and part of that national group. And it subsequently is leading to disengagement socially and politically from that mainstream society. And I think as these processes are unfolding simultaneously, they're also contributing to strained intergroup relations at a societal level. And if you think about it in this really broad macro way, this framework is suggesting that media environments and the way that they're depicting minority groups within these multicultural societies aren't simply just reflecting what's happening on the ground, reflecting the intergroup relations as they're happening and the tensions that they're happening. They're actually actively structuring the psychological conditions under which those threats are emerging and those tensions are emerging and they're persisting. And that's all I wanted to present. Thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take any questions.